A little girl sat alone on a forgotten bench in the pouring rain, clutching her chest, whispering words so fragile they nearly vanished in the storm. "Please, my chest hurts so much." At that moment, a man who had everything: power, wealth, prestige, stopped his car. He didn't know that kneeling beside this trembling child would shatter the walls around his heart and force him to face the question we all fear: what truly matters when life asks you to choose? This story isn't just about a millionaire CEO or a child in the rain. It's about finding family where you least expect it, about love that can heal wounds deeper than medicine, and about the courage to stay when it would be easier to walk away. Stay with us, and if this story moves you, subscribe to the Retold Stories, because some stories can change everything. The road twisted through the Colorado mountains like a ribbon unraveled by the storm. Rain lashed against the windshield in endless streams, and the wind tore through the tall pines as if determined to uproot them. Ethan Marshall guided his sleek black electric car through the chaos with mechanical precision. Inside the cabin, silence reigned. Only the hum of the engine and the rhythmic swish of the wipers broke the quiet. For a man like Ethan, silence had long been his companion, his armor against a world he no longer cared to feel. He was the celebrated CEO of Meridian Renewables, a clean energy empire worth billions. Newspapers praised him as a visionary, a savior of the planet, a model of efficiency. Yet, in the reflection of the rearview mirror, the man staring back at him looked hollow, drained, as if each accolade had stolen something rather than given it. He lived in a Denver high-rise overlooking the skyline, yet rarely stayed there. His weekends were spent in a glass cabin near Aspen, surrounded by designer furniture he barely touched and rooms so perfectly arranged they felt uninhabited. To outsiders, he had everything. To Ethan, he had nothing left that mattered. As the storm thickened, his headlights carved through a wall of fog. That was when he noticed something unusual. On a narrow bend of the road stood an old wooden bench, weather-beaten and forgotten, the sort of relic that should have collapsed years ago. But what made him ease off the accelerator was not the bench itself, but the small figure hunched upon it. At first, he thought it a trick of the shadows, another shape among the trees. Yet as his car rolled closer, the outline became undeniable. A child, alone, soaked to the bone. For a fleeting second, his instinct told him to keep driving. Someone else's responsibility, not his. Perhaps a reckless parent was nearby. But as the headlights swept across the figure, he saw the girl clutching her chest, her thin arms wrapped around herself as if to hold her body together. And then he heard it, faint but piercing. A voice carried even through the rain. "Please, my chest hurts so much." The words struck him like a blade. Ethan pulled his car to the shoulder, his pulse quickening. He opened the door, and the storm assaulted him instantly, drenching his coat and numbing his skin. He sprinted toward the bench, his polished shoes slipping in the mud, and crouched in front of the girl. She was no more than 7, her lips pale, her skin clammy, her small body trembling violently. Wet strands of hair clung to her cheeks as her eyes flickered half open, barely registering his presence. Without thinking, Ethan slipped off his expensive coat and wrapped it around her tiny frame. The fabric engulfed her, yet her shivering didn't stop. Hey, can you hear me?" His voice cracked, softer than he intended. The girl coughed weakly, a sound so raw it startled him. He lifted her into his arms, shocked by how light she felt, as if he were holding only bones and damp clothes. Her breath rattled, uneven and short. "Stay with me, sweetheart," he muttered, his own chest tight with panic. He carried her back to the car, shielding her fragile body from the storm as best he could. Inside the car, warmth blasted from the vents, but Ethan barely noticed. He buckled her into the passenger seat, his hands trembling, then jammed the clinic into his GPS. 12 minutes. 12 endless minutes. He drove like a man possessed, the wipers struggling to keep up as his eyes darted between the road and the fragile child beside him. Her small hand, pale and shaking, slipped free of the coat and rested on the console between them. He reached out instinctively, brushing his fingertips against hers, and for the first time in years, he felt something pierce through the numbness in his chest. By the time he screeched into the emergency entrance, his heart was hammering so loudly it drowned out the storm. He leapt out, lifted her into his arms again, and burst through the sliding doors. "Help!" he shouted, his voice breaking. Doctors and nurses rushed forward, their movements swift and practiced. One of them, a woman with calm eyes and a steady voice, introduced herself as Dr. Rachel Myers. Within seconds, they had the girl on a table attaching monitors, fitting an oxygen mask, and calling out medical terms Ethan barely understood. He stood frozen, dripping water onto the sterile floor, watching as machines beeped and nurses scribbled notes. "She said her chest hurt," he whispered when the doctor asked what had happened. She was just sitting there, alone. Rachel glanced at him, her expression tight but compassionate. "Looks like pneumonia. Possibly hypothermia. We'll need tests." Her focus shifted back to the child, but Ethan stayed fixed. He couldn't move, couldn't walk away. And then something happened that sealed him in place. The girl, eyes fluttering shut, reached blindly into the air. Her small fingers caught his sleeve and clung weakly, as if she were anchoring herself to him. Her lips moved beneath the mask, forming words, so faint he almost thought he imagined them. "Don't leave." The sound tore through him. In that moment, Ethan Marshall, the man who once defined his life by stock prices and energy reports, felt something crack open inside. He didn't know this girl. He didn't know her name. But he knew one truth as if it had been written into his bones. He wasn't leaving. Hours later, Ethan sat outside the hospital room, drenched clothes clinging to his skin, hands trembling against his knees. Through the frosted glass, he could see the faint outline of the girl now identified as Laya, lying small and fragile in the bed, machines blinking beside her. Each time he replayed her whisper, "Please, my chest hurts so much." It struck him anew, breaking down the barriers he had built over decades. The phone in his pocket buzzed with urgent calls from his company, but for once, he ignored them. His gaze never left the door, his mind circling the same thought. This child had no one else. And perhaps neither did he. The storm outside began to fade, leaving behind a heavy mist that clung to the town of Aspen Valley. Yet inside Ethan, something had just begun. For years he had believed himself untouchable, a man above feeling, detached from pain or joy alike. But all it took was one small hand on his sleeve, one fragile plea in the rain, to remind him that even the coldest hearts could be called back to life. The first night in the hospital blurred into a restless haze. Machines beeped steadily, nurses moved in quiet rhythm, and Ethan sat anchored to the chair outside the small room, refusing to leave even when exhaustion pressed against his eyelids. Each time he thought of walking away, he remembered the girl's hand gripping his sleeve, the fragile plea not to be abandoned. Something about those words had locked him into place, and now he could not imagine himself anywhere else. By morning, Dr. Rachel Myers returned with updates. Pneumonia, early stage. Hypothermia, from exposure. Antibiotics had been started quickly, and there was reason to hope. Yet there was another concern lingering beneath her calm tone. Tests showed unusual readings, markers in the blood that suggested more than simple infection. When Ethan pressed her, she admitted there were signs of toxic exposure, chemicals that did not come from nature. It was a discovery that unsettled her as much as it enraged him. Ethan had lived his life surrounded by charts, data, and environmental projections, but he had never seen the human cost this close. This was not a report filed away for shareholders. This was a child, frail and gasping, carrying evidence in her bloodstream of something sinister. He thought of the mark on her wrist, faint but telling, and of the way her thin body had curled on that roadside bench. Whoever had left her there had not only failed her, but possibly harmed her. Hours later, a nurse handed him a small backpack, retrieved from the girl's side. Inside were a few worn clothes and a folded envelope. In shaky block letters, the outside read, "For Laya, if anything happens." Ethan's chest tightened as he opened it. Inside was an address scrawled hastily, nothing more than a lot number and town nearby. No name, no explanation. Dr. Myers quietly confirmed the place was a trailer park outside Maple Ridge, known for its poor conditions and worse reputation. Ethan drove there that afternoon. The storm had passed, but the sky remained heavy, a pale gray sheet over the mountains. The trailer park was a scatter of dented homes and broken fences, where silence carried more menace than peace. At Lot 14, the air was damp, with mildew and decay. Inside the trailer, he found a mattress on the floor, food cans rusting on the counter, and a notebook, water-damaged but filled with frantic handwriting. Dates, symptoms, drawings of maps, and the same phrase repeated over and over. It is the water. The truth struck him harder than the storm the night before. Mother, Sarah, had been tracking illnesses and water samples, scribbling notes that pointed to Westbrook Industries, a mill upstream that had long avoided accountability. Ethan flipped through the notebook, each page filled with desperation, each line a cry for help ignored. In the corner of the room, a doll lay abandoned, its button eye missing, its yarn hair tangled. He picked it up, brushing off dust, feeling the weight of the child who had once clutched it. As he turned to leave, a man appeared, rough from years of hard labor, a cigarette clinging to his lip. His words were blunt. The woman had asked too many questions about the mill, and one day she vanished. No police, no neighbors speaking up, just gone. Ethan listened, his anger mounting. This was not coincidence. The notebook, the blood tests, the child left alone, they all pointed to something deliberate, something ugly, hidden beneath the silence of a small town. Back at the clinic, he returned the doll to Laya. She stirred weakly, her small fingers curling around it with sudden strength. Her eyes opened just enough to see him, and she whispered, "You came back." Ethan knelt beside her, his throat tight, and said softly, "I promise. I will not leave." For the first time in years, his words were not a negotiation or a promise to investors. They were a vow from somewhere deeper, somewhere he had thought long dead. But promises carried weight, and soon the cost revealed itself. A message appeared on his phone late at night, untraceable, sharp as a knife. "Speak out, and you lose everything. Stay quiet, and she lives." Ethan read it again and again, the meaning twisting in his chest. They knew, whoever had poisoned this child, whoever had silenced her mother, knew he was involved now. His wealth, his reputation, his company, all of it could be destroyed if he spoke. And yet, the thought of turning away felt worse than losing it all. Meanwhile, his board was growing restless. Calls piled up, urgent, messages demanding his presence. A shareholder meeting loomed, and whispers of resignation grew louder. He was warned, in clear terms, "Align yourself with this story, and you drag Meridian into ruin. Return to Denver or step aside." Ethan sat in the sterile hallway of the clinic, phone pressed to his ear, listening to threats disguised as professional concern. For the first time in his career, he did not care. He set the phone down, turned back to the child's room, and stayed. Days passed, and Laya's condition slowly stabilized. Color returned to her cheeks. Her breathing evened, though her body still bore the signs of neglect. She began to speak in small fragments, her words hesitant, but braver each day. Ethan found himself bringing her small gifts. A blanket, pajamas soft as clouds, a storybook read aloud in the quiet evenings. The hospital room transformed from a sterile cell into a place of warmth, with drawings taped to the wall and fairy lights strung above her bed. Nurses smiled when they saw the unlikely pair. The powerful CEO sitting cross-legged on the floor, helping a child color outside the lines. One morning, a new drawing appeared on the wall. 3 stick figures, one tall with messy hair, one smaller in a dress, and one with long hair drawn like rays of fire. Above the tall figure's chest, a red crayon heart had been filled in so heavily it nearly tore the paper. Ethan stared at it longer than he intended. When Laya noticed, she said nothing, simply turning back to her crayons as though it meant nothing at all. But to Ethan, it meant everything. The conflict around him grew sharper. Lawyers began circling, reporters sniffing at the edges of the story. His assistant called, begging him to return before everything collapsed. But each time he looked at Laya, fragile yet fierce in her own quiet way, he knew his decision had already been made. He would not walk away. He would not allow silence to win. For once, he was no longer driven by numbers or projections. He was driven by the weight of a child's hand in his, by the truth that demanded to be spoken. And as the days turned into a rhythm of care, Ethan felt a shift within himself. He had not planned this. He had not expected to become entangled in a battle between power and innocence. Yet here he was, holding crayons in a hospital room, listening to a little girl laugh despite the scars she carried. For the first time in decades, he understood that true strength was not measured in wealth or influence, but in the choice to stay, even when every force around him urged him to leave. The decision weighed on Ethan long before he admitted it aloud. He could feel it each night as he sat by Laya's bed, her breathing steady beneath the gentle glow of the monitors. The world outside was calling him back, pulling with the force of power and responsibility. But inside that small hospital room, something greater anchored him. Every time her hand reached for his, even in sleep, it reminded him what was truly at stake. It was not just her recovery, it was her belief that someone would finally stay. The warnings came swiftly. His phone buzzed with messages that cut sharper than the storm had days before. Anonymous threats whispered the price of speaking the truth. Stay quiet, and she lives. Speak out, and you lose everything. Ethan read those words in the dim hospital corridor, his reflection staring back from the darkened glass. Once, he would have obeyed. He had built a life on compromise, on the careful balance of profit and reputation. But now he saw the cost of silence carved into the frail body of a child, and he could no longer pretend it was not his fight. The board gave him an ultimatum. Return to Denver, face the investors, silence the rumors, or they would assume his resignation. His chairmanship, his reputation, the billions tied to his name, all hung in the balance. For a long time he sat with the weight of that choice, staring at the girl asleep beneath. A blanket he had bought, her doll tucked safely in her arms. The life he once guarded so carefully felt paper-thin compared to this. When the call ended, he did not pack a bag. He did not return to the city. Instead, he stayed in Aspen Valley, waiting for the dawn of a different kind of reckoning. It began with a drawing. Laya had pressed a crumpled paper into his hands that morning, her crayon smudged across the page. 3 stick figures stood together, holding hands, with dozens of smaller figures drawn behind them. Above it, in bold, uneven letters, she had written, "Tell the truth." Ethan held it through the night, through the hours of doubt, through the memory of the SUV parked outside his cabin with headlights burning like eyes in the dark. By sunrise, his decision was final. When he stood at the podium outside the state capitol, the February air bit through his coat and the cameras flashed like lightning. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised, microphones waiting. He looked out at the crowd, at strangers bundled against the cold, and then down at the drawing folded in his pocket. His voice trembled at first, but steadied with every word. He introduced himself not as a CEO, but as a man who had witnessed a truth too heavy to ignore. He named the company. He named the toxins. He told them about the little girl left on a roadside bench in the rain, poisoned by silence. And for the first time in years, he did not speak to impress or to persuade. He spoke because he could no longer do anything else. The crowd stirred. Murmurs rippled like waves until they became voices, then applause. What began as a single spark grew louder, stronger, undeniable. Reporters shouted questions. People raised their fists. Strangers nodded with tears in their eyes. And as Ethan stepped back from the microphone, he felt not fear, but relief. The truth was no longer hidden in notebooks or whispered in the dark. It had been spoken, and it would not be silenced again. The fight, however, did not end there. Legal battles brewed, headlines exploded, and threats intensified. Yet Ethan's focus remained on Leia. While lawyers drafted motions and officials opened investigations, he stayed by her side. He read to her, colored with her, laughed at her shy jokes. The world could rage outside. But inside their small circle, life grew warmer. Laya's health improved steadily. Her cheeks flushed with color instead of fever. Her laughter, replacing the gasps of pain. For the first time in her life, safety was not a fleeting dream, but a daily presence. In the courthouse weeks later, the room was quiet, except for the turning of papers. Ethan stood before the judge, his voice steady as he explained why he sought guardianship, not by blood, not by obligation, but by choice. The judge listened, skeptical, reminding him that guardianship required stability, long-term commitment, and more than emotion. Ethan agreed. But when he said she was not his responsibility but his choice, his words carried a weight no legal term could capture. It was then that the small voice cut through the courtroom air. Laya ran forward, clutching a drawing, and threw her arms around him. "I want to stay with him. He makes the bad dreams stop." The silence that followed carried more force than any argument. The judge granted the motion. Days later, they moved into a modest townhouse on the edge of Aspen. It was not the polished glass cabin Ethan had once considered home. This place had warmth, soft rugs, curtains that glowed in the morning sun, and a fireplace Laya quickly nicknamed the Dragon's Mouth. She explored every corner as though it were a castle built just for her. Her laughter filled the rooms, echoing against walls that had never known joy before. Ethan watched, a quiet smile tugging at his lips, feeling for the first time that he had stepped into a life that was not hollow but whole. Spring arrived slowly, melting the snow into streams that ran through the valley. In the book, small backyard, Laya spun in circles, her yellow sweater catching the sunlight, her arms stretched like wings. She no longer resembled the fragile child he had carried from the rain. She was alive, radiant, her hair dancing in the wind as her laughter rose like music. Ethan stood at the window, a mug cooling in his hand, watching her. He had faced threats, lost status, and abandoned a world that once defined him. Yet as he looked at the girl who had become his anchor, he knew he had gained more than he had lost. He had gained family, chosen and true. That evening, Laya handed him a drawing, 3 figures again, but this time with one drawn above, surrounded by light, labeled Mom. Her eyes shone with something soft, a trust that no words could fully express. Ethan felt a warmth spread through his chest, the kind of ache that comes not from emptiness, but from love, overflowing. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, whispering words he never thought he would speak. "I love you, kiddo." She smiled back, fearless and certain, and said, "You feel like home." For a man who had once measured his worth in billions, that single sentence was wealth beyond measure. And as the fire crackled in the dragon's mouth and the stars rose over the mountains, Ethan realized the truth he had been running from his whole life. Home was not a place, nor a company, nor a reputation. Home was a promise kept, a hand held through the storm, and a little girl who finally believed she would never be left behind again. There are stories that pass through our lives quietly, like whispers carried by the wind, and then there are stories that stop us in our tracks, demanding to be felt, remembered, and shared. The journey of Ethan and Laya was one of those rare stories. It began with a little girl on a rain-soaked bench, clutching her chest, whispering words so fragile they nearly disappeared into the storm. And it grew into a promise that reshaped not only her life, but the life of the man who chose to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. Ethan was a man who had everything the world says matters: power, wealth, influence. Yet he had lost touch with the very heartbeat of life. Laya was a child who had nothing, no protection, no safety, no one to call her own. And yet she carried within her the strength to awaken a soul that had long been asleep. Their meeting was no accident. It was a collision of emptiness and hope, despair and love, silence and truth. In that collision, something extraordinary was born. The road ahead was not simple. It came with threats, sacrifice, and the dismantling of everything Ethan thought defined him. But as the headlines faded and the world turned its attention elsewhere, one truth remained unshakable. A child who once whispered, "Please, don't leave," no longer faced the storm alone. She had someone who stayed, someone who fought, someone who believed she was worth more than silence. And a man who once stood at the top of the world, alone in a tower of glass, discovered that the greatest success of his life was found not in boardrooms or billions, but in the quiet laughter of a little girl who called him home. This is more than a story about a CEO and a child. It is a story about the choices that define us. About the courage to speak the truth when silence would be safer. About the miracle of finding family where you least expect it. And about the healing that comes when love is stronger than fear. If you carry anything with you from this journey, let it be this. No matter how broken the world may seem, love has the power to rewrite everything. At the Retold Stories, we believe in sharing stories like this, stories that remind us of our shared humanity, that inspire us to stand up, to care, and to believe in hope again. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe and join our community, because when we tell these stories together, we keep alive the truth that it is never too late to change, to love, and to choose to stay.